Morgan Wilwyn was not your typical witch. She was earnest, a little clumsy, and brimming with enthusiasm about sharing her craft with anyone or anything willing to learn. One crisp autumn morning, she decided her latest protege would be none other than Peppercorn, her sleek black cat. Peppercorn had been her companion for many years, offering advice and meows and purrs whenever Morgan was in doubt. But until now, she had never tried to teach him spells. What could go wrong? Peppercorn, my fluffy friend, Morgan said, adjusting her pointed hat, which had a tendency to flop over one eye whenever she got excited. We've been together through thick and thin, balsamic potions and basil charms, broom rides and bungled brews. Today, I'm going to teach you the magical arts. Peppercorn lifted his chin with a look that clearly stated he found her plan questionable. Although he was used to the routine of stirring potions with his tail and sniffing out rare ingredients, spellcasting seemed a tall order for a cat. Still, the determined witch set out a worn vellum-bound grimoire on her wooden kitchen table. The house, perched at the edge of a twisted oak forest, hummed with faint magical energy. Shelves around the table were cluttered with miniature glass vials and jars labeled Dragon Tear Salt, Unicorn Mane Sheen, and Batwing Dust. Everything smelled of herbs, smoke, and sugar cookies. She gently tapped the book. "We'll start with something simple," she announced, flipping to a page with swirling runes. "A light spell. Everyone should know one, even a cat." Peppercorn meowed, tail flicking in acknowledgement. He hopped onto an armchair across from Morgan. On the table, a small candle flickered feebly in its holder, casting shadows across old teacups and mortal pestles. Morgan took a deep breath. "Repeat after me, dear Peppercorn, Luxa Luminara Totalis." She gave a practiced flick of her wrist. The candle glowed brighter, illuminating the jar labels and the battered cauldron in the corner. Satisfied, she turned to Peppercorn for his turn. The cat stretched, standing on his hind legs like he'd seen Morgan do so many times. He opened his mouth, and out came an odd mixture of purring and meowing that sounded suspiciously like Maraxa, Murnarara, ta-ta, and then a sneeze. Nothing happened for a moment. Then, a sudden flash of light burst from the candle, bright enough to momentarily blind both witch and feline. After the burst subsided, the candle flame was gone, replaced by a tiny glowing fish swimming through the air with slow, tranquil movements. Morgan's eyes widened. "Oh my!" she exclaimed. "That's not exactly in the lesson plan." She reached out a hand, and the fish scattered into sparkling motes of light that shimmered into nothingness. Peppercorn looked quite proud of himself, swishing his tail as though he had done exactly what was intended. Morgan shook off her surprise. "It seems your incantation needs a bit more enunciation, Peppercorn. Let's try again." The second attempt was equally unpredictable. The candle stayed a candle this time, but the flame turned a deep shade of purple and grew arms, which flailed around comically before dissipating. Morgan pinched the bridge of her nose, took a steadying breath, and placed a reassuring hand on Peppercorn's furry head. "We'll move on for now," she said, chuckling. "I'd hate for the entire house to disappear." She gently guided Peppercorn away from the table and toward the front stoop of her cottage, where a row of potted herbs and peculiar plants grew. There were bright blue mushrooms, clover with sciller leaves, and one lonely, scraggly cactus that always gave Morgan the side eye. Peppercorn sniffed the plants, possibly wondering which one they'd experiment on next. Morgan flipped through the grimoire until she found a page labeled Growth Spell. She tapped a passage near the top of the page with her fingertip. "We'll make this dandelion grow bigger," she explained, indicating a small daisy-like flower that roared like a mini lion whenever anyone got too close. The dandelion was currently the size of a teacup, with a gentle, hushed roar that sounded like distant thunder. "If you do it right, Peppercorn, it'll transform to, oh, maybe the size of a pumpkin. Are you ready to try?" Peppercorn perched on the stoop's edge, whiskers twitching. Morgan recited, "Agnifico Viridiana Crowtha." The diasyllabes began to stretch upward, petals expanding, miniature roars increasing in volume until the flower was the size of a small squash. The witch nodded, pleased. Your turn, Peppercorn. Nice and steady now. It's all about focusing your energy. The cat drew himself up, flicked an ear in concentration, and meowed something that did sound suspiciously like Agnapithta. He let out a squeaky hiss at the end, as if trying to shape the final syllable. The dais island wiggled. At first, it seemed to rise only an extra inch, but then it began to twitch and quiver. Its small roars grew into full-blown howls, so loud that the cactus shot a thorn in terror. With a pop, the daisy lion exploded in a burst of petals and seeds, showering the porch in confetti-like debris. Morgan sputtered, arms flailing as her hat fell off, and Peppercorn yowled, batting daisy lion seeds out of his whiskers. The belated roars whirled around them in ghostly echoes. The seeds were scattered everywhere, leaving Morgan's tidied herb row looking as though a tiny carnival had just paraded through. The cactus let out an indignant squeak, cross with the intrusion of flying seeds. Well, Morgan said, dusting off her robe, that was dramatic. Perhaps I should have chosen a less excitable plant. Peppercorn slinked back into the house, tail in the air, as if to declare he was too dignified for horticultural embarrassment. Not one to be deterred, Morgan called him over for a third lesson. She presented a small, unassuming teapot on the table. We'll practice conjuring an object out of thin air, she said, wagging a finger to emphasize the lesson. We'll work with something benign like a spool of thread, so no major harm if we get it wrong. Peppercorn seemed vaguely interested, tapping the teapot with a paw. Morgan recited the incantation, Cotura spulisa conjure. A soft, shimmering swirl of light spun through the air, and a perfectly ordinary spool of thread dropped onto the table with a small clack. Peppercorn hopped in place and meowed approvingly. He got the gist, or so Morgan hoped. Your turn, she said, patting his head. Nice and easy, Peppercorn. One spool of thread. Coming right up, Peppercorn angled his head. There was a brief, bright flicker of magic around him. His lips parted in what probably sounded like, Kotura spur jarger! Then, with a final meow, something indeed appeared above the teapot in a whirl of crackling energy. But it was no spool of thread. It was a large, giggling fish. Again. The slippery creature flopped onto the table as Morgan yelped and scrambled to grab it before it could slither off the edge. Peppercorn watched, fascinated, as Morgan wrestled the fish. It smelled strongly of the sea, and water droplets flew in every direction, splashing onto the floor and conjuring a slight fishy stench in the otherwise cozy cottage. Morgan managed to toss the fish into a conjured bucket that appeared out of thin air, something she was thankfully adept at. She wiped her brow, near laughter at this point. We've clearly got a fish motif going on. That's all right, Peppercorn, she said, repressing a grin. We just need to find the right approach. Let me think. Her mind turned to the possibility that maybe Peppercorn's incantations needed a more direct translation of meows. She rummaged through her shelves until she found a small bottle labeled Speech Salamander Extract, rumored to help align magical energies with a user's voice to improve incantation clarity. This might help, she explained, carefully pouring 2 drops onto Peppercorn's pink tongue. Peppercorn swallowed and let out a sudden, startling cough that sounded like a half-meow, half-donkey bray. The cat's eyes widened, clearly unsettled by this new sensation. Morgan scrambled for a handkerchief, worried something had gone wrong. Before she could react, Peppercorn opened his mouth, uttering a single, perfectly enunciated word in a haunting, echoey voice. Hello. Morgan nearly dropped the handkerchief. Oh my goodness, Peppercorn, she gasped, clapping her hands in delight. You can talk. Peppercorn blinked, flicked his tail, and tested another word. Morganon. The voice warbled in an eerie sing-song tone, making Morgan giggle in excitement. We can practice spells with actual words now, she said, ecstatic. Maybe this will help you enunciate properly and reduce the fish phenomenon. Peppercorn, still looking slightly alarmed by his newfound vocalization, bowed his head in acceptance. Well then, let's get back to basics and try the light spell one more time, shall we? Morgan said, leading Peppercorn into the living room where a few stubby candles were arranged around the fireplace. The cat hopped onto a velvet-topped footstool, cleared his throat, and said in that otherworldly echo, Lux illuminara totalis. At first, Morgan's grin spread wide. The candle flames brightened, filling the room with a warm glow. But then, Peppercorn sneezed in the middle of the final syllable. A spark of magic scattered upward, and instead of the candles achieving a new brilliance, the living room walls turned polka-dotted in flickering neon colors, as though a carnival light show had been plastered onto the wallpaper. Peppercorn glanced around, tail lashing, while Morgan struggled to contain her laughter as she surveyed the kaleidoscope ambiance. All right, she said, leaning against the back of the footstool for support. We'll wait for that to wear off. It should only be a couple of hours. In the meantime, let's try something else. Maybe we should conjure something you actually like, Peppercorn. How about a bowl of milk? Peppercorn's ears perked up at the mention of milk, and he gave an enthusiastic mew. The cat perched on the stool, crouched as if preparing to pounce on a spell. All right, Morgan said, opening the grimoire to another page. Repeat, lactura conjura maxima. Peppercorn forced out each syllable in that echoing voice. Lactura conjura maxima. The magic shimmered around his furry body. At first it seemed to be working. A bright swirl coalesced in midair, forming the outline of a bowl. Morgan rubbed her hands in excitement, anticipating a perfect bowl of milk. Then a crackling sound erupted. The swirl of magic started changing shape. One moment it was a bowl, the next it was a swirl of water, then air, and suddenly a cloud of thick fog billowed through the room. Out of the fog popped dozens of mice made of swirling vapor. They scurried around, squeaking in high-pitched unison before evaporating. Peppercorn crouched, eyes huge, instinct screaming, "Pounce!" But before he could, the vapor mice vanished, leaving behind a single drop of milk that plopped on the floor, lonely and anticlimactic. Oh dear, Morgan mumbled with a laugh. You nearly had it, Peppercorn. The cat padded to the solitary drop and licked it off the floor with a decidedly unimpressed expression. Clearly, the local vapor mice population had done little to satisfy him. Morgan decided they might need practical training. Come on, she said, heading out the back door. We'll try something simpler, an everyday cleaning spell, a real crowd pleaser for witches who hate dusting. The backyard of Morgan's cottage was an overgrown area with a wooden broom or two propped against a fence, a small workbench for sorting potions, and an assortment of mismatched chairs around a fire pit. They found a pile of dusty old tomes stacked on a rickety stool. Morgan sneezed as she brushed away cobwebs. These will serve as a test, she announced, pointing at the grimy covers. We'll do a quick dust-away spell. Not too difficult, right, Peppercorn? The cat strolled up, whiskers quivering. Morgan demonstrated, chanting, Scrubbus dustus vanish. A gentle breeze of magic whooshed over the books, removing dust and cobwebs instantly. She turned to him. All right, you try. Peppercorn, apparently liking the echo of certain syllables, repeated, Scrubbus dust vanish. For a split second, the dust and cobwebs lifted from the books, swirling in a funnel above them. Morgan grinned. This time, it really looked like Peppercorn had perfected the incantation. Then the funnel of dust congealed into one large gray mass, which took on the shape of a tiny dusty tornado monster, with eyes of two swirling leaves. It let out a rasping squeak and started dancing on the seat of one of the chairs. Peppercorn let out an alarmed hiss, while Morgan waved her wand frantically to disperse the dusty creature. The swirl of dust soared upward, sprinkling the yard in a fine layer of debris, leaving leaves and twigs in Peppercorn's fur. Morgan coughed, wiping her eyes. All right, we're done with cleaning for today, she croaked. Despite the mishap, she couldn't help but laugh. Peppercorn wasn't the most conventional student, but he was nothing if not entertaining. By now, Peppercorn appeared worn out, panting softly. Morgan decided to call for a break. She retreated to the garden's small table with an umbrella overhead, rummaging for some midday snacks. She conjured tea in a saucer of milk. This time she did the work herself, ensuring no illusions of fish or vapor mice. Peppercorn nestled at her feet, slurping the milk contentedly, tails swishing in the dust motes floating through the sunbeams. Morgan gazed into her battered grimoire, scanning for a simpler approach. Something about the cat's attempts consistently produced these spontaneous transformations. Fish, polka dot walls, vapor mice, and swirling dust monsters. She tapped her chin thoughtfully, remembering a line in the introduction about finding a student's natural magical affinity before teaching them standard spells. Peppercorn, she said, leaning down to address him directly. Maybe you're not a standard caster. Witches and wizards learn these incantations one way, but you might need a custom approach. You're a cat, after all, majestic in your own way, with your own brand of mischief. He blinked, licking leftover milk from his whiskers. Still, Morgan wondered exactly how to discover Peppercorn's unique magical cylinder. She studied him and then rummaged for a second book, Feline Arcana, a guide to magical cats. She flipped it open, scanning for clues. The pages mentioned that cats may excel in illusions or shape-shifting. Others might be proficient at summoning small creatures, explaining the fish that kept appearing, and the vapor mice, she giggled. Of course, Peppercorn has an affinity for conjuring animals. Choir practice might help him refine that skill. Morgan decided to test the theory. Directing Peppercorn back into the house, she placed him before an empty fishbowl on the kitchen table. Clean, water-filled, with a few decorative rocks at the bottom. All right, we'll see if you can conjure a fish properly. Inside the bowl this time. Keep it tidy so it doesn't flop around, okay? Peppercorn stiffened, ears twitching. He eyed the bowl, then Morgan, as if to say, Are you certain you want me to do this? Morgan nodded and turned the page to Conjuring Animal Familiar. The incantation read, Summonari Animali Selecta. She read it aloud for Peppercorn, carefully pronouncing each syllable. Peppercorn's voice resonated with that peculiar echo as he repeated, Summonari Animali Selecta. The water in the bowl rippled. A bright flash of silver light illuminated the kitchen. Then, clear as day, a goldfish popped into existence. A plump, bright orange and white fish calmly swimming around. Morgan let out a delighted squeal. Peppercorn looked rather amazed himself, leaning over the bowl to watch the fish circle lazily. This is wonderful, Morgan exclaimed. You did it perfectly, Peppercorn let out a triumphant meow, swishing his tail. It was the first time that day he had followed an incantation precisely, without summoning an unexpected calamity. Morgan clapped her hands. Now we know your specialty is conjuration of living creatures, she mused, petting Peppercorn's head. Let's see if we can refine that. We'll try conjuring smaller creatures, but let's keep them safely in a container so we don't have more fiascos. Peppercorn hopped down from the table, prowling around with a new sense of confidence. Morgan set a large glass cage in the middle of the living room, carefully removing the decorative items from inside so it was empty and safe. All right, she said. How about a hamster this time? Ready? Peppercorn perched on a nearby ottoman, tail swaying back and forth. Morgan read out the next incantation in the Feline Arcana, altering it slightly for a hamster. Summonari Hamsterum Selecta. Peppercorn nodded, inhaled, and gave it a try, carefully shaping each syllable. The incantation ended in a soft chirp. Inside the glass cage, a swirl of shimmering dust coalesced into a fluffy hamster with big, curious eyes. It squeaked and stared around at its surroundings. Morgan almost squealed again. Peppercorn, you did it! Another perfect conjuration! She felt a surge of pride for her magical cat. Delighted by their success, Morgan offered Peppercorn a treat, a small sardine from her pantry. Peppercorn devoured it happily, purring. At this rate, Morgan said, you'll be summoning entire menageries in no time. Eager to capitalize on the momentum, she flipped through the Feline Magic Guide to find a slightly more advanced challenge. Her eyes fell upon a spatial menagerie summon, which was typically used by advanced witches and wizards to conjure illusions of multiple creatures at once. Quite complex for a first day of lessons, but Peppercorn seemed to handle conjurations better than anything else. Let's give it a try, she ventured, placing Peppercorn in a spacious corner of the living room. Still polka-dotted with neon from his earlier fiasco, Morgan read the incantation. Illusoria Menagerie Felinum. The instructions suggested that the user imagine various animals, focusing on illusions rather than living summons. If you do it properly, she said, stroking Peppercorn's head, you'll fill the room with illusions of dancing animals. Peppercorn flicked his tail, clearly intrigued. He closed his eyes, presumably imagining the menagerie. Morgan saw his whiskers quiver with excitement. Then, in that resonant tone, he pronounced, Illusoria, menagerie, filinum. The air wavered as lines of color glimmered into view. For a moment, Morgan saw shimmering outlines of elephants, giraffes, flamingos, and penguins, all in ephemeral rainbow silhouettes. Seahorses floated near the ceiling, deer pranced around the chairs, and a row of flamingos perched on the windowsill. Morgan gasped in awe. For a split second, it was pure magic, a mesmerizing spectacle of dancing illusions and swirling colors. Then Peppercorn sneezed again. At the final syllable, the illusions flickered uncertainly, as though they had been yanked off script. One by one, the animals blinked into partial reality. The elephant's trunk reached forward, nearly bumping Morgan's hat off her head, while the giraffe bent its neck through the living room chandelier, gently rattling it. No longer just illusions, they were semi-physical apparitions. That was problematic enough, but the real trouble arrived when each conjured creature began to produce illusions of its own. The flamingos coughed up fish illusions. The penguins flapped their wings and inadvertently summoned miniature snowstorms. The living room turned into a chaotic swirl of half-real, half-imagined animals. Even the polka-dotted walls seemed to warp with the strain of so many illusions gone amok. "Oh dear!" Morgan exclaimed, dancing around to dodge a bounding kangaroo illusion that soared over the coffee table. She raced to the grimoire, flipping pages for a counterspell. Peppercorn hopped up onto the mantel, watching with wide eyes as the illusions devolved into a carnival of swirling shapes and random illusions upon illusions. Eventually, Morgan found the correct page, recited a cancellation incantation, and everything vanished in a brilliant flash of pastel smoke. The living room was left silent, except for the goldfish still swimming in its bowl and the hamster nibbling on a pellet in the glass cage. The polka dots on the walls slowly faded, leaving the original wallpaper. Morgan collapsed onto the sofa in relief. Peppercorn hopped down from the mantel, meowing softly, the echo in his voice less pronounced now that the salamander extract was wearing off. Morgan let out a relaxed purr of her own, stroking her friend's fur. "That," she said between giggles, "was quite the menagerie. Perhaps next time we'll try illusions in a wide-open field, where there's more space to handle them." Peppercorn nodded, or rather blinked, in agreement. Regardless of the chaos, Morgan felt a swell of gratitude for her peculiar gift of a cat. Yes, they'd left a trail of Daisyland seeds on the porch, polka dot residue on the living room walls, and some watery fish smell lingering in the air. But Peppercorn wasn't just any cat. He brimmed with raw conjuration talent, even if it manifested as comedic mishaps. Morgan had a sneaking suspicion that, with a bit of discipline, Peppercorn might even surpass her own abilities in certain areas of magic. She motioned Peppercorn onto her lap, where he settled contentedly, purring as she rubbed behind his ears. "You've done splendidly today," she cooed. "A few mishaps, sure, but that's how we learn. We'll keep practicing. Maybe tomorrow we'll focus on illusions specifically, or minor transformations that don't involve half the animals in existence flooding our living room." Peppercorn let out a sleepy meow that almost sounded like yes, though it might have been her imagination. Morgan set aside the Feline Arcana book and brewed a fresh pot of tea in the kitchen. The late afternoon sunlight streamed in through the windows, illuminating motes of dust floating lazily in the air. For once, the cottage felt serenely calm. The goldfish in the bowl swam serene laps, and the hamster in the glass cage dozed in a bundle of sawdust. Peace was restored, temporarily. Just as Morgan sank into her chair with her teacup, Peppercorn hopped onto the table, sniffing around with what looked like curiosity. She eyed him warily. "What is it now?" she teased, stroking his chin. Peppercorn nudged the box of tea leaves with his head, then turned to stare at a small container of sugar cubes. "Don't get any ideas about conjuring sugar mice and cream elephants," she joked. Peppercorn let out a soft huff. Tilting his head as if offended at her easy teasing, Morgan smirked. Sorry, I trust you. Just proceed cautiously if you're going to try anything new. The cat stared at the sugar cubes, whiskers trembling. Morgan set down her teacup, half expecting another wave of illusions, but Peppercorn simply gave the sugar cubes a gentle swat with his paw, knocking one off the table. Then he hopped down after it, chasing it across the floor like a toy before batting it into a corner. With a triumphant meow, he declared victory over his sugary prey. Morgan laughed, grateful for the break from magical mayhem. Together, they finished the afternoon in peace. She plucked Daisylene petals from her hair, while Peppercorn playfully batted at them, occasionally letting out strange half-meows reminiscent of human speech. If he said anything coherent, Morgan couldn't quite tell. Nonetheless, the atmosphere was warm and cheery. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Morgan lit a fire in the living room fireplace. The golden glow danced on the wooden floor, reflecting off the glass hamster cage. Peppercorn sat on the windowsill, looking out at the stars peppering the sky. Morgan joined him, setting aside her pointed hat and letting her messy braids fall over her shoulders. She thought about the day's events, the Daisyline explosion, the polka dot fiasco, the summoned fish, the illusions that turned the cottage into a brief zoo. Despite the chaos, she felt proud. Her cat was learning magic, albeit with comedic slip-ups. She couldn't wait to continue teaching him, excited to see what unpredictable conjurations he might attempt next. Peppercorn turned from the window and gently pressed his face against her hand, purring. No more lessons for tonight, Morgan said softly, returning the affectionate gesture. But tomorrow's another day, my furry familiar. She scratched his ears and he closed his eyes, thoroughly enjoying the attention. As the embers in the fireplace crackled, Morgan drifted into restless dreams of a cat-run conjuration school, with Peppercorn at the podium, instructing a row of wide-eyed kittens and magical spells far beyond Morgan's wildest imagination. It was both hilarious and oddly comforting to picture. The prospect of sharing magic with creatures who by nature were already so mysterious and mischievous tugged a tender string in Morgan's heart. By the time she woke the next morning, Peppercorn had curled beside her on the windowsill, dozing peacefully. Morgan gently lifted him, carrying him to his favorite cushion by the hearth. On tiptoe, she found her hat, which had somehow ended up near the hamster cage. She noticed the hamper of laundry in the corner, in dire need of a cleaning spell. Then she remembered how disastrously the last cleaning attempt had gone with Peppercorn's incantation. She stifled a laugh. Perhaps they'd wait on that particular lesson. She patted Peppercorn's head. How about we start small again today, she mused aloud. Maybe conjuring some squeaky toys, non-living objects. That might be safer. Peppercorn cracked an eye open, gave a languid stretch, and hopped off his cushion to wind himself around Morgan's ankles. They strolled to the kitchen, where Morgan brewed a fresh pot of coffee for herself and prepared a saucer of milk for Peppercorn. The polka dot sheen had faded from the walls, though a faint sparkle seemed to remain in certain corners. A small reminder of the cat's comedic misfires. Morgan decided she rather liked it that way. A subtle memory of their wacky spell lessons. Setting aside the feline arcana, Morgan instead retrieved an old battered notebook. She opened to a blank page and began jotting down ideas for new spells tailored to Peppercorn's unique conjuration style. She considered illusions of toy mice for practice, or maybe conjuring a ball of yarn that wouldn't unravel into monstrous tangles. She also added a side note, try to fix mispronunciations but watch for sneezes. Peppercorn leapt onto the table, curling up near the notebook, purring softly. Morgan smiled at him, warmed by a sudden rush of gratitude. She couldn't recall a time when magic had been quite so amusing. A day filled with fish flopping, dust monsters dancing, illusions running amok. It was far from the typical, structured training she'd undertaken in her youth, but it was lively, it was authentic, it was an adventure fit for the kind of witch who, in her own way, embraced the unpredictability of life with a sloppy grin and a flopping hat. She closed the notebook, feeling Peppercorn's contented rumble beneath her hand. Ready for another day of magical mishaps? She asked softly. Peppercorn blinked slowly, tail flicking once. which she took as a yes. Together, they prepared to embark on their second day of lessons, armed with hope, curiosity, and most importantly, a healthy dose of humor for all the delightful slip-ups yet to come. After all, when teaching magic to a cat, what else could one expect but a bit of wonderfully ridiculous chaos? And at the heart of it, there was Morgan Wellowind, an earnest witch with a love for all things magical, and Peppercorn the conjuring cat, valiantly attempting to speak and cast incantations, no matter how many fish might crash land in the kitchen or how many daisy lions might end up sprawled across her porch. Each pothole on the path of new knowledge was part of the grand tapestry that made their little cottage come alive with bright, purring magic. Their bond was sealed with every burst of unintended sorcerer, each mishap weaving them closer together in a comedic, enchanting journey. And so they laughed, they learned, and the cottage glowed with the charm of a witch and her cat discovering magic in the most amusing ways possible. Peppercorn might never be the conventional spellcaster Morgan once envisioned, but he was absolutely perfect in his own mischief-laden, paw-swatting fashion, and that, Morgan decided, was precisely how magic was meant to be.